He found a strange kind of peace in places where no one expected to see him. The roar of a film set, the flashing lights of a premiere, the constant, low hum of public recognition, it all felt like a costume he couldn't take off. But here, in the sprawling, musty labyrinth of a used bookstore on the edge of the city, he was just another shadow. The air was thick with the sweet, dusty scent of decaying paper and forgotten stories. Sunlight struggled through grimy, high-up windows, illuminating swirling galaxies of dust motes. It was quiet, the kind of deep, layered quiet that absorbs sound and makes you feel like you're underwater. He needed that. He needed to feel like a person again, not an idea of a person. He ran his fingers along the spines of books. Their titles a mix of things he'd never heard of and classics he felt he should have read by now. Philosophy, that felt right. He was searching for something, a manual, maybe an instruction booklet for a soul that felt like it was running on empty. He had everything a person could supposedly want: success, comfort, a life that looked good from the outside, but inside, there was a persistent, hollow ache. It was like being a guest at a party where you didn't know anyone. And the music was just a little too loud. He was so lost in thought that he didn't notice the man at first. He wasn't a worker, not really. He was just, there. He was arranging a stack of books on a lower shelf, his movements slow and deliberate. He was of an age that was impossible to pin down, maybe 60, maybe 90. He wore a simple, faded flannel shirt and worn-out jeans, the kind of clothes that blend into the background. But when he stood up and turned, his eyes were anything but background. They were a clear, soft brown, and they held a depth of kindness that felt startlingly out of place. Like finding a warm, lit fireplace in a cold, abandoned ruin, the man smiled, a gentle, easy curve of his lips. "Looking for answers in here?" he asked, his voice calm and raspy, like the turning of an old page. Keanu offered a small, polite smile in return. "Isn't everyone? I think I'm just looking for the right questions." The man nodded, as if this was the most sensible thing he'd heard all day. "That's a better place to start." Most people grab a book like they're grabbing a hammer. They think if they just find the right one, they can smash their problems apart. They don't realize a book like this is more like a window. You're not supposed to break it. You're supposed to look through it. There was something about the way he spoke that was captivating. It wasn't poetic, not really. It was just simple, true. Keanu found himself leaning against the bookshelf, genuinely interested. "A window. I like that. You tell stories for a living, don't you?" the man said. It wasn't an accusation, just a statement of fact. Keanu tensed for a second, the familiar guard going up. Here it comes. The John Wick reference, the Matrix quote. But it never came. "You build worlds for people to visit for a couple of hours," the man continued, his gaze unwavering and kind. "That's a powerful thing. But do you ever worry that people are starting to like the windows more than they like their own houses?" The question hit him with surprising force. It was a thought that had been nibbling at the edges of his mind for years. He saw it on the streets, in restaurants, on the subway. People with their heads down, lost in the glowing rectangles in their hands, living in a world of instant reactions and curated perfection. They were collecting echoes instead of making their own music. "Yeah," Keanu admitted, his voice quieter now. "I do worry about that. It feels like everyone's drifting. Like we're all on separate rafts, getting further and further apart." The man's expression softened with a profound sadness, but also with a deep understanding. "That's the silence," he said, almost to himself. "The space between the rafts, the silence. We live in the loudest time in history," the man explained, gesturing vaguely towards the world outside the bookstore walls. "But it's a noisy noise. It's the sound of 1,000 people shouting at once, but nobody's listening. It's the sound of distraction, of constant movement without any direction. But underneath all that, there's a real silence growing, a heavy one. It's the sound of connection being lost, of empathy getting tired and giving up." Keanu felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cool air in the store. This stranger was articulating a feeling he had carried for so long, a nameless dread that he could never quite put into words. It was the feeling he got when he saw a young couple sitting together at a cafe, both scrolling through their phones, lost in separate worlds. It was the feeling he got reading the comments online, where anger and judgment were the default language. It was a spiritual emptiness, a quiet rot. It feels heavy, Keanu agreed, like something bad is about to happen, but you can't see what it is. The man looked at him then, his eyes seeming to see straight through the famous face, past the actor, and into the heart of the man who was just trying to figure things out. He took a small step closer. The air between them seemed to still, to grow thick and significant. "The loudest storms are preceded by a strange and heavy silence," the man said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "The birds stop singing. The air goes still. Everyone feels it, but most ignore it. They just wait for the rain." He reached out and placed a hand gently on Keanu's shoulder. The touch was warm, solid, and strangely comforting, yet it sent a jolt through him. "Don't just listen for the thunder. Learn to recognize the quiet." Then he turned and walked away, disappearing down a narrow, crowded aisle between towering shelves of history and poetry. Keanu stood there for a moment, the man's words echoing in his mind. Learn to recognize the quiet. He shook his head, a faint, bewildered smile on his face. What a strange, incredible encounter. He wanted to thank him, to ask his name. He walked down the aisle the man had taken, his eyes scanning the shadows. The aisle was empty. He frowned, thinking maybe the man had ducked into another section. He walked to the end of the aisle and peered around the corner. Nothing. He walked back to the front of the store, toward the old wooden counter where a young cashier was half-heartedly reading a magazine. "Excuse me," Keanu began. "The older gentleman who was working in the philosophy section?" The cashier looked up, a bored expression on his face. "Sir?" The man in the flannel shirt. "He was just here." The cashier blinked slowly. "Sir, I've been here for 3 hours. I'm the only one working today. No one's been in that section but you." A cold knot formed in Keanu's stomach. He looked back down the long, silent aisles, the dust motes still dancing in the slivers of light. The man had been so real. His voice, his eyes, the warmth of his hand on his shoulder. It was more real than most conversations he'd had in months. He walked out of the store and into the noise of the city, but the noise seemed different now. It seemed thinner, like a flimsy covering for the heavy, profound silence the stranger had shown him. And for the first time, he realized he could hear it. And it was terrifying. The words from the stranger in the bookstore followed him out into the city noise like a ghost. Learn to recognize the quiet. For the first few days, he tried to shake it off. He told himself it was just a strange encounter with a particularly wise, eccentric man. Maybe he was a retired professor, or just someone who had seen enough of life to speak in riddles. He threw himself into work, into the familiar rhythm of learning lines and hitting marks. The controlled chaos of a film set a comforting distraction. But the quiet was there too. It was in the brief moments between takes, when the crew would immediately reach for their phones, their faces illuminated by the cold blue light, their minds a million miles away from the room they were in. The laughter and chatter that used to fill those pauses were now replaced by the silent, frantic tapping of thumbs on glass. He started noticing it everywhere. It wasn't an absence of sound. The city was as loud as ever. It was an absence of something else, of presence. He'd sit in a coffee shop, watching the world through the window, and he'd see it. A young couple sat at a table near him, their hands resting just inches apart on the table. They were on a date, he guessed. But they weren't talking. They were both scrolling, their faces bathed in that same ghostly light, their expressions blank. They were physically together, but they were in separate universes. The space between them wasn't just empty. It was heavy. It was the silence the man had talked about. It felt like a wall, invisible but solid. One afternoon, he went for a walk in a park. It was a beautiful day, the kind that makes you feel glad to be alive. Kids were shouting on the playground, their laughter like music. But on the benches surrounding the playground, almost every single parent was staring down at a phone. They were guardians, but their minds were gone. He watched a little boy, maybe 5 years old, look over at his mother after successfully climbing the monkey bars, his face bursting with pride, desperate for her to see. "Mom, Mom, look!" he yelled. The mother didn't look up. She just gave a vague, "Uh-huh, that's great, honey," her eyes never leaving the screen. The boy's face fell. The light in his eyes dimmed just a little. It was a tiny, almost invisible moment of heartbreak, but to Keanu, it was a scream. It was the sound of a connection being severed. A moment of shared joy lost forever. He felt a growing sense of isolation, like he was the only person in the world who could see this strange sickness. It was as if the stranger had given him a pair of glasses, and now he couldn't take them off. He saw the silence in the way people walked down the street, their shoulders hunched, their ears plugged with headphones, creating a personal bubble to keep the world out. He saw it in the way a street musician, a talented guitarist pouring his soul into a beautiful, intricate melody, was completely ignored by a river of people flowing past him, their faces locked onto their own private dramas on their phones. The music was just background noise to them, no different from the traffic or the wind. It had no meaning. It was just sound. The dread began to build inside him, a slow, creeping cold. It wasn't a fear of monsters or of sudden disaster. It was a much deeper fear, a fear of a slow, quiet fading. He saw how impatience was becoming the default emotion. A car horn would blare the instant a light turned green. A sharp sigh would come from someone in line at the grocery store if the person in front of them took too long to find their wallet. Small courtesies, holding a door, making eye contact, offering a simple smile were becoming rare, almost radical acts. People seemed to be locked in a constant, low-grade state of annoyance with each other, as if everyone else was just an obstacle in their personal, frantic race to nowhere. He wanted to talk about it. He'd be on the phone with his agent discussing a new project, and the urge to just blurt it out would be overwhelming. "Do you ever feel like we're all just disappearing?" But he couldn't. He knew exactly how it would sound. They would humor him, maybe, or they would worry. The story would twist. It would become a headline. Troubled starseeds decay everywhere. The truth of what he was feeling would be lost, turned into a caricature. So he stayed quiet, which only deepened his own sense of the gathering silence. He was becoming a part of it. One evening, he was in a small neighborhood market. An elderly woman at the checkout counter was fumbling with her change, her hands shaking a little as she tried to count out the coins. The young cashier sighed loudly, rolling her eyes, her foot tapping an impatient rhythm on the floor. The man behind the woman in line started to huff and puff, crossing his arms and glaring at the back of her head. The air grew thick with tension, with a collective, unspoken hostility. It was such a small thing, a moment that should have been filled with a little patience and understanding, but instead it was filled with a silent, communal rage. Keanu felt a chill run down his spine. This was it. This was the brittleness. The social fabric wasn't just thinning. It was becoming abrasive, rubbing people raw until they bled irritation. That night, he couldn't sleep. He paced his apartment, the city lights twinkling outside his window like a distant, cold galaxy. The world felt like a house of cards, and he could see a faint breeze starting to blow. He knew he couldn't stay here in the middle of it all. The constant observation was eating him alive. He needed to get away, not to escape the feeling, but to understand it. He needed to go somewhere big, somewhere ancient and solid, where the silence was real and natural, not this man-made, suffocating thing. He needed to stand on a mountain and feel the wind, to see a sky so big it made his own problems feel small. He needed to get far away from the noise so he could finally hear the quiet for what it truly was. A plan began to form in his mind, a desperate need to find high ground, not just physically, but spiritually. The drive was long, the city shrinking in his rearview mirror until it was just a smudge on the horizon. He traded the cacophony of sirens and traffic for the steady hum of tires on asphalt, then for the crunch of gravel. He left his car at the trailhead, a small metal box in a world of towering stone and ancient trees. The air here was different. It was thin, crisp, and smelled of pine and damp earth. It was a clean smell, a real smell, and he pulled it into his lungs like it was the first breath he'd ever taken. The weight of the world, the dread that had been his constant companion, didn't disappear, but it felt smaller here, less significant against the immense, silent power of the mountains. He walked for hours. The trail was steep and rocky, demanding his full attention. Each step was a negotiation with the uneven ground. His leg muscles burned, his lungs ached, and a thin sheen of sweat cooled on his skin. It was a good pain. It was an honest pain. It grounded him in his body, in the physical reality of the world, pulling him out of the abstract fears that had been swirling in his mind. He passed through groves of aspen, their white bark like bones in the dappled light, and climbed above the tree line into a world of jagged rock and stubborn, low-lying shrubs. The wind picked up, whispering secrets that were older than language. He was searching for something, though he didn't know what. A sign? An answer? Or maybe just a moment of peace, a single, clean thought that wasn't tainted by the image of a blank face staring at a screen. He pushed onward, driven by a restless energy, until he finally reached a wide, flat summit just as the sun began its slow descent. The world fell away beneath him, a breathtaking panorama of peaks and valleys, stretching out to a horizon that seemed to go on forever. He sat down on a flat rock, his body exhausted, his mind a quiet, weary blank. The sunset was a masterpiece of color. The sky bled from a brilliant orange into a soft, bruised purple, then into a deep, velvety blue. The clouds caught fire, glowing with an inner light. It was so beautiful it hurt. It was the kind of beauty that made you feel small and insignificant, but in a good way, a way that made your own troubles seem like dust motes in a cosmic wind. But as the last sliver of the sun disappeared below the horizon, a profound loneliness washed over him. He was a tiny speck on a giant rock, floating in an infinite universe. The silence of the mountain, which had felt so cleansing on the way up, now felt immense and empty. The spiritual ache he had been trying to escape returned, deeper and sharper than before. He felt utterly, completely alone, and then he didn't hear a footstep or see a movement. The man was simply there, standing a few feet away, his back to the fading light. It was the stranger from the bookstore. He was dressed the same, in a simple flannel shirt and worn jeans, but here, on this mountaintop, he was different. The last rays of the sun seemed to cling to him, outlining his form in a soft, golden glow that didn't belong to the dying day. There was an aura of impossible peace around him, a stillness that contradicted the howling wind. His face was in shadow, but Keanu knew those eyes were the same, filled with that same deep, piercing kindness. Keanu's heart hammered against his ribs, a wild, frantic drumbeat in the vast silence. He wanted to speak, to ask how, to ask why. But his throat was dry and no words would come. The man took a step closer, his voice the same calm, raspy whisper from the bookstore. Yet it seemed to cut through the wind perfectly. "You have learned to hear the silence," he said, his tone not one of accusation, but of simple acknowledgement. "You feel it growing in the spaces between people. You see it in their eyes?" Keanu could only nod, his body frozen. "It is a heavy thing to carry," the man continued, his gaze filled with a profound sadness that seemed to encompass the whole world. "But hearing the quiet is only the first step. Now you must see what follows." He closed the distance between them and reached out, his hand not rough or calloused, but warm and impossibly gentle. He placed his palm on Keanu's forehead. The touch was like a key turning in a lock he never knew he had. The world dissolved. The wind, the rock, the cold air, it all vanished. He was standing in a suburban street on a perfect summer day. The lawns were green, the houses were neat. But something was wrong. A man was yelling at his neighbor across the fence, his face contorted with rage. Their argument was about something trivial, a tree branch that hung over a property line. But the words they were using were like poison. They weren't just arguing. They were trying to destroy each other. Other neighbors came out, not to calm them down, but to take sides, their phones held up, recording. He saw the raw, gleeful hatred in their eyes, the thrill of conflict, the the complete absence of mercy. The scene shifted, and he was in a family's living room. A teenage girl was crying, pointing to her laptop, where a humiliating photo of her was being shared over and over. Her parents were scolding her, not for the bullies, but for being foolish enough to let the photo be taken. The love had curdled into judgment. He saw 1,000 tiny betrayals, 1,000,000 small acts of cruelty, all amplified and celebrated. Communities weren't just breaking. They were eating themselves alive from the inside out, the vision blurred and reformed. He was in a dark, cluttered room. A group of young people were slumped in chairs or on the floor, their bodies limp and neglected. But their faces were alive, lit by the glow of virtual reality headsets. They were laughing and talking, their voices echoing from within the machines, but their physical selves were empty shells. A half-eaten pizza on the table was covered in mold. Dust lay thick on every surface. One of them reached for a glass of water and knocked it over, the liquid spreading across the floor. The person didn't even notice. They were too busy living in a world that wasn't real. He saw their humanity withering, their muscles atrophying, their connection to the physical world, to touch and taste and smell, fading away into nothing. They were ghosts haunting their own lives. Then came the final, most terrifying vision. The color drained from the world, leaving everything in shades of gray. He stood in the heart of a great city. The skyscrapers were still standing, the cars were still parked on the streets, but there was no movement. No sound. It was a city of ghosts. He saw people walking, but their movements were slow, aimless, like puppets with their strings cut. He looked into the eyes of a woman as she shuffled past him, and he saw nothing. No light, no sadness, no anger, no love. Just a flat, empty void. It was the silence he had been feeling, but now it was complete. It was a nation that had forgotten how to feel. It had forgotten how to care. It had forgotten how to hope. The lights hadn't just gone out in the city. They had gone out in the people. It was a fate worse than death. It was the death of the soul. The hand was lifted from his forehead. The world rushed back in. The wind, the cold, the sharp smell of rock. He was on his hands and knees on the summit, gasping for air, his body trembling uncontrollably. Tears streamed down his face, freezing on his cheeks. The sun was gone, and the sky was a black canvas pricked with the cold, distant light of 1,000,000,000 stars. The man was gone. He was alone again, but the loneliness was now filled with a horrifying, crushing knowledge. The weight of the vision was a physical thing, a stone pressing down on his chest, making it hard to breathe. It wasn't a dream. It was a warning, and he was the only one who had heard it. The world came back to him in pieces. First was the cold, a sharp, biting wind that stole the breath from his lungs and made his teeth chatter. Then came the feel of the rough, unforgiving rock beneath his hands and knees. He was trembling uncontrollably, a deep, bone-rattling shudder that had nothing to do with the mountain air. His face was wet with tears that had frozen on his cheeks, leaving his skin tight and stiff. He pushed himself up, his muscles screaming in protest, and looked around. The summit was empty. The man was gone as if he had been a dream, a hallucination brought on by exhaustion and altitude. But the visions were still there, burned into the back of his eyes, playing in a horrifying loop inside his mind. The gray city. The empty eyes. The people who were ghosts in their own lives. It wasn't a dream. It was a memory of a future that hadn't happened yet. Getting down the mountain in the dark was a blur of terror and instinct. He had no flashlight, no map. He just stumbled onward, guided by the faint outline of the trail under the dim light of a crescent moon. Every shadow looked like one of the hollow-eyed people from his vision. Every gust of wind sounded like a whisper of the coming silence. He fell several times, scraping his hands and knees, but he barely felt the physical pain. The real pain was inside him, a crushing weight that made it hard to breathe. He felt like he was carrying the entire doomed future of a nation on his back, and it was crushing him. The question echoed in his mind with every painful step. Asterisk, why me? Why was I shown this? He wasn't a priest or a prophet. He was an actor, a person who told made-up stories for a living. He was the least qualified person in the world to carry a truth, this immense, He finally reached his car as the first hint of gray light touched the eastern sky. He collapsed into the driver's seat, locking the door and wrapping his arms around himself, still shivering. The safety of the car offered no comfort. The visions were now trapped in there with him. He sat there for a long time, just breathing, trying to force the images away, but they refused to leave. He saw the rage on the neighbor's face, the cruel glee of the people recording the fight. He saw the vacant bodies of the young people lost in their virtual worlds, their real lives turning to dust around them. He saw the final, soul-crushing gray of the city where hope had gone to die. He started the engine. The roar of the motor, a small, temporary defiance against the silence in his soul. As he drove away from the mountain, the first, most desperate thought took hold. He had to tell someone. He had to tell everyone. He imagined it, a press conference, a live interview. He would stand up and tell the world what he had seen. He would describe the visions, the warning from the man on the mountain. But then the cold, hard logic of reality set in. He could picture it perfectly. The reporters would exchange skeptical glances. The headlines would write themselves. Hollywood star's bizarre apocalypse claim, or Keanu Reeves' spiritual meltdown. They would analyze his mental state, his past traumas, his recent film choices. The message, the terrifying, vital truth of the vision, would be completely lost. It would become a joke, a meme, a footnote in his celebrity biography. Shouting the warning from a rooftop wouldn't save anyone. It would only get him locked away, dismissed as a madman. The horror of the vision was matched only by the horror of his own powerlessness to share it. The despair that followed was a dark, suffocating blanket. He drove for hours aimlessly, the world outside the window a blur. What was the point of any of it? If this was the future, if humanity was on this inevitable path to spiritual emptiness, then what did anything matter? His work, his life, his connections with people, it all felt meaningless in the face of the coming gray. He thought about just disappearing. He could sell everything, buy a boat, and sail off to the middle of the ocean. He could find a remote cabin and live out his days in isolation, letting the world fall apart without him. It was a tempting thought, a way to lay the crushing weight down. But even as he considered it, he knew it was a coward's way out. The man on the mountain hadn't shown him the future so he could run away from it. He checked into a cheap, anonymous motel off the highway, a place with thin sheets and the faint, lingering smell of bleach. He stood in the shower, letting the hot water pound against his skin, hoping it could wash away the images from his mind. It didn't. He looked at his reflection in the steamy mirror, at a face he barely recognized. It was pale and haunted, his eyes wide with a fear that went deeper than any simple emotion. He looked like a man who had seen a ghost, but he knew the truth was so much worse. He had seen the ghost of the future. He sat on the edge of the bed, the springs groaning under his weight, and let the despair wash over him completely. He felt small and utterly defeated. And in that moment of total surrender, a new thought began to form, a tiny flicker of light in the overwhelming darkness. He remembered the man's first words to him in the bookstore. Asterisk, don't just listen for the thunder. Learn to recognize the quiet. Asterisk, the vision wasn't about the thunder. It wasn't about the final, catastrophic storm. The vision was about the quiet. It was about the process of getting there. It was about the small, seemingly insignificant moments of disconnection, the loss of empathy, the slow, quiet rot of the human spirit. And then, the realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. The vision wasn't a prophecy. It was a warning. It wasn't a fixed, unchangeable future. It was a potential future. It was a signpost pointing down a very dark path, showing the destination if humanity didn't change course. And the purpose of the vision wasn't for him to become a prophet of doom, shouting warnings to the masses. The world wasn't ready to hear it, and he wasn't the one to deliver it in that way. The purpose of the vision was much simpler, much more personal. The message wasn't for the world. The message was for him. The weight on his chest didn't disappear, but it changed. It was no longer a crushing burden of despair. It was a responsibility, a purpose. He couldn't stop the storm, not by himself. but he could fight the quiet. He couldn't force the entire country to change, but he could change himself. He could become a living example of the alternative. His mission wasn't to prevent the terrifying fate, but to actively push against it, one small act at a time. He wasn't meant to be a prophet. He was meant to be a lighthouse. A quiet, steady source of light in the encroaching darkness. He didn't need to save the world. He just needed to be a candle. And in the face of such overwhelming darkness, a single candle can make all the difference. A sense of calm, a quiet determination, settled over him for the first time since he had stepped onto that mountain. He knew what he had to do. The drive back to the city was different from the frantic escape from the mountain. This time there was no panic, only a quiet, steady resolve. The world outside the car window was the same, but he was looking at it with new eyes. The silence was still there, a thick, invisible fog hanging over everything, but it no longer filled him with despair. It now looked like a challenge. It was a vast, dark room, and he knew he couldn't turn on all the lights at once, but he could light his own little candle. The first thing he did when he got back was not to call his agent or read his scripts. He walked through his home, a place that had always felt more like a high-end storage unit than a sanctuary, and started to let things go. He filled boxes with expensive art he'd never really looked at, with clothes he'd only worn once, with gadgets that were supposed to make him happy, but had only added to the noise. He didn't do it with anger or sadness, but with a sense of clarity. He was making space, not just in his home, but in his life. His relationship with his money changed. It had always been a source of discomfort, a weird byproduct of a job he loved. Now it became a tool. But he didn't want his name on buildings. That felt like the old way, the noisy way. Instead, he worked through people he trusted, quietly funding things that felt like they were fighting the good fight. He found a small, struggling theater in a forgotten part of the city that put on plays for kids. A place that taught them how to create together, how to speak and listen and be part of a story that was bigger than themselves. He helped a group of retired carpenters and builders start a program where they taught young people how to make things with their hands, to build a chair, a bookshelf, a simple wooden boat. It was about the feel of real wood, the satisfaction of creating something tangible in a world that was becoming increasingly virtual. He funded outreach programs that didn't just hand out food, but sat down and ate with the homeless, offering them a moment of dignity and conversation, a reminder that they were not invisible. He was investing in living rooms, not data centers. He was building places for the human spirit to gather. The most profound changes, however, were the small, personal ones. They happened on the film sets, which were now his primary mission field. The movie set was a perfect little model of the world, a temporary city filled with people under stress, often more focused on their own problems and their phones than on each other. He made it his mission to be the antidote to that. He learned the names of everyone, not just the main actors and directors, but the electricians, the caterers, the people who swept the floors. He would spend his breaks talking with them, asking about their families, their dreams, listening to their stories with a focus that made them feel like they were the most important person in the world. He remembered a young lighting technician who was nervous about his first big job. Instead of ignoring him, Keanu spent 10 minutes showing him a better way to rig a light, sharing a story about his own early mistakes and giving him a confidence that lasted for the rest of the shoot. It was a small act, but for that young man it was everything. It was a moment of connection in a world that often felt cold and transactional. He still carried the weight of the vision. Some nights he would wake up in a cold sweat, the image of the gray, empty city burned into his mind. He would see the silence winning. He'd be stuck in traffic and see a sea of faces in the cars around him, all lit up by their screens, all isolated in their own metal boxes. He'd read the comments on an article online and see the casual cruelty, the way people tore each other down for having a different opinion. In those moments, the task ahead felt impossible, like trying to empty the ocean with a teaspoon. The despair would creep back in, a cold hand on his heart. But then he would remember the man on the mountain. He wasn't asked to empty the ocean. He was just asked to offer a cup of water to one person. That was it. That was the whole mission. He found his peace not in changing the world, but in changing his own corner of it. He understood that the terrifying fate he had been shown wasn't a prophecy set in stone. It was a choice. It was the path people were on, but every path has forks in the road. Every single person, every single day had a choice to either feed the silence or to make a little noise. To either look at their phone or to look at the person in front of them. To either close their door or to open it. His life became a series of small, deliberate acts of rebellion against the quiet. One rainy afternoon, he was sitting in a small, nondescript coffee shop. He was just a man in a hat and a coat, watching the rain streak down the window. He noticed an older woman sitting alone at a table nearby. She was staring into her half-empty coffee cup, her shoulders slumped, a look of profound loneliness on her face. She looked lost, like a ship without a harbor. In the past, he might have felt a pang of sympathy, but then looked away, not wanting to intrude, not wanting to deal with the awkwardness of a conversation. But not now. He got up, walked over to her table, and gently asked, "Excuse me, I hate to bother you, but would you mind if I joined you? It's always a little nicer to share the rain." She looked up startled, her eyes wary at first. But then she saw his face, not the famous face, but the genuine kindness in his eyes. She gave a small, hesitant smile and nodded. He sat down, and they talked for the better part of an hour. They didn't talk about movies or anything important. They talked about the rain, about the best kind of pie, about a dog she had when she was a little girl. He just listened, giving her his full, undivided attention, a rare and precious gift in the modern world. When he finally left, he looked back and saw her sitting there, a genuine, warm smile on her face as she took a sip of her coffee. She didn't look so lost anymore. He walked out into the rain, the cold air feeling fresh and clean. He knew he hadn't saved the world. He hadn't stopped the coming storm. But in that small coffee shop, for one person, he had been a candle. He had pushed back the darkness, if only for an hour. And as he walked, he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that this was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.